So my name is Heather Offerman, and today I'll be talking to you a little bit about my research, which is the effects of pronunciation instruction on second language learner Spanish, and this will be a comparative analysis of various instructional methods. Okay, so before we get started, I'd like to give an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'll talk about the goals of the study, or both studies, I should say, because there is a production or pronunciation study, and then to follow, there is a perception study. After I discuss both studies, there will be discussion of the results of both. And then to close, there will be several conclusions that entail pedagogical implications along with future directions. Okay, so to get started, for the goals of the study, primarily we want to investigate the impact of 3 different types of pronunciation instruction methods in the second language classroom. And these 3 types are explicit instruction, visual feedback, and a combination instructional approach of those 2 previously mentioned ones combined. The second goal is we want to investigate which type of instruction, if any, outperforms the other types of instruction. And then lastly, want to investigate to what extent does pronunciation instruction affect second language learner perception of sounds. So in this particular study, we're going to look at after pronunciation instruction, can second language learners identify certain sounds as more native-like in Spanish and more English-like. So first we're going to get started off with the review of the literature for second language pronunciation. So first thing to note here, with the communicative approach being the most popular over many years, pronunciation instruction has widely been ignored, and this is due to the fact that the communicative method wanted to kind of ignore the audiolingualism method that wasn't very successful back in the 50s and 60s. However, recently, many researchers have begun to design and evaluate different pronunciation teaching methods for adult second language learners and have advocated for their use in classroom settings. And then finally, it has been found by various researchers that second language students often want to receive pronunciation instruction and they find it really valuable to their second language learning. However, there is very much a noted lack of materials provided for instructors and for students in improving in pronunciation. So now we'll talk a little bit about the 3 different types of instructional methods that we're going to focus on today. So the first is explicit instruction. And here I'm defining this as the use of the International Phonetic Alphabet to teach sounds in place of graphemes in the first language or second language, repetitions and modeling by the instructor, as well as what we call corrective or explicit corrective feedback. And this is where the instructor circulates throughout the classroom, gives feedback to the students, and explains to them how to produce more target-like pronunciation. The second type is visual feedback. This is the use of various kinds of technology to display visual representations of student or second language learner productions, as well as native speaker productions. And this is often used through or shown through sound waves and spectrograms. So for sound waves and spectrograms, if you're not familiar, I'll get to those 2 topics in just a minute. So the reason that I chose both of these types of instruction is because they have been found to be the 2 most popular in the literature up to date. With explicit instruction, there's been a wide variety of studies that have shown that second language learners have improved significantly. And then this visual feedback paradigm, this is a little bit newer, but the same thing. In all the research that's been done up to date, or most of the research has shown that students have improved significantly after receiving this type of feedback. So that brings us to our last type of instruction, which is called combination instruction. And this is simply just the combination of explicit instruction with the visual feedback paradigm. And this has been carried out by only just a couple of researchers, as it's still kind of a new process. So, before we move on, we do need to mind the gap in the literature, being that as there have been many types of studies coming about, what's missing from this emerging line of research is a detailed comparative analysis to assess which are best practices and which are most beneficial to second language learners, and various researchers have noticed this in the last decade. Okay, so before we move on to the actual study, we're going to talk a little bit about something called voice onset time. So, Spanish and English both contain the voiceless stop consonants p, t, and k in word initial position, with the primary difference being found in voice onset time. So I'll explain a little bit about what this is in just a second. So, it's broadly defined as voicing of pre or post-stop release. So what does that mean? English and Spanish, for voiceless stop consonants at the beginning of a word, they are always post-release. And again, what does that mean? So, if you can see this visual here, we have type 1 and type 2. We're just going to focus on these two. So, this is what directly relates to Spanish and English. So, for type 1 we have p, and here it says lip closure, and then where these two lines separate, that is the lip opening. Here, for English, we have p, and then we have our opening, and then we see this little H right here, which represents the aspiration. Then we see where the ah, so the voice begins to, or the vocal folds begin to vibrate. Then here, type 2, this is going to be most related with Spanish. So we can see here we have pa, and then we have the opening, and then immediately, or almost immediately, we have ah, begins to sound. So as you can tell, there's very little to no aspiration there. To give you a little bit more of an idea of what this looks like, for English speakers, so I'm a native speaker of English, for English speakers, when we want to emphasize aspiration, for example with the word please, we often say please, like that, because even though we may not know it necessarily, we know in our minds, whenever we're trying to emphasize, we emphasize this aspiration at the beginning. For the second example, if you put your hand in front of your mouth and you want to say please, you say p, please, and you can feel the burst of air. Same with the word past, past. And then in Spanish, if we want to say the word pasado, and we put our hand in front of our mouth, pasado, we can tell that there's very little to no aspiration that comes out there. So here's the difference. Okay, so just a little bit more about voice onset time. As is explained by Hammond, English is about 60 to 80 milliseconds and it's a long lag, whereas, as described by Campos and Walde, that Spanish is short lag and it's about 0 to 30 milliseconds at the onset. So here's a visual representation, and this is the sound waves and spectrogram of two different speakers saying the word todo. So I'm going to explain what it looks like. So as you can see, we've got ta and o separated out here. And if we look up here for the spectrogram, it's very, very dark right here. And then we see right here for the sound waves, there's very short, kind of squiggly bunched together. We can tell that that's where the aspiration is. So if we're wanting to look at how long it is, we can see this one, that looks pretty short. However, if we look up here, same thing. We've got a lot more darker color up here. We see the same very short little squiggly sound waves right there. We can tell this is where the aspiration is, and we see that it's longer. So here where it's longer, we then know that this is typically English accented, or first language speaker English accented todo, and here is a native Spanish speaker production of todo. And so just a little bit more about VOT. For native speakers of English that are learners of Spanish, this is something that is very characteristic and often very obvious to native speakers of Spanish. So although this idea of VOT is not necessarily something that impedes intelligibility, it can cause issues or costs in comprehensibility. And what I mean by that is for comprehensibility, usually that means for the cost of it, it takes maybe a few seconds. If you hear something that someone says that's a little accented, your brain takes a few seconds and then, oh, okay, that's what they said because there's this accent there. And then also another thing that can play a role is accentedness, as noted by During and Monroe, and that they also say that sometimes native speakers create judgments about non-native speakers due to accentedness. So that leads us to our research questions. Number 1, does pronunciation instruction implemented here as either explicit instruction, visual feedback, or a combination of the two result in an improvement of second language pronunciation? In this case, improvement of phonetic production is defined as significant reduction in voice onset time by English-speaking second language learners of Spanish. And then our second question here is, in a comparative analysis, is there a difference in the effectiveness of the 3 different pronunciation approaches to second language production? So for our first question regarding do all of them work or not? Do they all help to improve? Our hypothesis is this. All experimental groups will significantly improve in their reduction of aspiration of the word initial voiceless plosives p, t, k in Spanish after having received a form of pronunciation instruction or training. And then for research question 2, this one's talking about, is one maybe better than the other? Our hypothesis is, while L2 learners or second language learners in all experimental groups will improve, it is hypothesized that the combination instruction group will improve more than the other groups. So let's get on to the methods for the production study. First, let's talk about the participants. Participants for both studies actually consisted of 47 participants. These were all intermediate level, 3rd semester university students taking a Spanish course. They were all native speakers of English. They were late learners of Spanish, so none of them learned it as a child or past puberty. And they also had very limited to no abroad experience. And then here I'll show you, this is how the participants were separated into groups, and these were all randomly assigned groups. Explicit instruction, 11 learners. Visual feedback, 11 learners. Combination instruction, 14. And the control group had 11 learners. Alright, so here we will talk about the order of the tasks that the second language learners took part in. So, for the tasks, all these tasks were done as a pre-test and a post-test. So there was a pre-test, then the second language learners took part in 3 types of pronunciation instruction, and I'll explain what those are in just a minute. But they did a pre-test, did the 3 different types of treatment or instruction, and then they had a post-test with each of these tasks. So task number 1, this is tokens embedded in a carrier phrase, and in this particular instance, it was a phrase that was say bla de nuevo, or again, say X again, say X de nuevo. For task 2, these were tokens embedded in an utterance or sentences. Task 3, tokens embedded in a controlled continuous speech task. So here it was a written short story. And then the 4th task, the last task, was tokens embedded in a spontaneous speech task, and this was in the form of a picture task. So all of these tasks were chosen to go from a more controlled type of task to the least controlled type of task. Today we're primarily going to focus on tasks 1 and 4, and this is because task 1 is the most controlled of the 4 tasks, and task 4 is the least controlled of all tasks. So, for the first task, the carrier phrase task, tokens were embedded in the phrase the X de nuevo. There were a total of 30 tokens. These were all evenly distributed for p, t, k. They were also evenly balanced for the 5 Spanish vowels a, e, I, o, u. And there were 2 of these each, so we had a total of 30 tokens for this task. And as you can see here, there's a table of some examples. So here for pa, di pesa de nuevo, ta, di tela de nuevo, ka, di quepo de nuevo. For the spontaneous speech task, this is task number 4. Tokens here, they were put into a picture task, as I mentioned earlier. This was kind of the same setup as the carrier phrase task. So again, 30 tokens total. There were the 3 plosives, balanced for the 5 Spanish vowels, and then done twice, so we had a total of 30. So here, what students or participants had, they had 2 slides per token. The first slide was kind of an instructional slide that says up here, repite la siguiente frase. So repeat the following sentence. Juan, and they had an image of Juan. Juan levanta la pesa. Pesa here was written in blue and had an image next to it, so that the learners would identify the token in blue with the image. Once they went to the next slide, they had a distractor item, which is Diego, and they had to insert Diego here, so, pero ahora Diego levanta la, and they only had the image of pesa, so that they weren't reading the word. They had to remember what the word was to insert it here. For the recordings, all the recordings by participants were recorded via Praat at home on their own personal computers or laptops. And Praat is a program that's free and widely available on the internet. So, all participants received training in class on how to use Praat by their instructor. And they were also instructed to record in a quiet place with no distractions. So as we can imagine, oftentimes if they go home and record themselves, sometimes their roommates interrupt them, sometimes there's TV in the background, or sometimes they think, it's a nice day, I'm going to go outside, so they were specifically instructed to stay at home and do it in a quiet place. And here again we have some sound waves and a spectrogram, and so this is kind of what it looked like after they had finished their recordings. They could see what it looked like. Okay, so moving on to the production trainings. Before I get into all types of trainings, so for the explicit instruction, visual feedback, combination instruction, and the control group did not have any type of instruction, but they did have a supplemental material. All went over the course of 6 weeks. So for explicit, visual feedback, and combination, all of those trainings were over the course of 6 weeks. And they all had 3 trainings, so every other week. Okay, so for explicit instruction, participants were shown the International Phonetic Alphabet. They were shown these symbols in order to differentiate between sounds and graphemes. Then also they were explained the differences in place and manner of articulation. They also took part in a repetition exercise with their instructor, receiving corrective feedback and written reinforcement via a worksheet that was passed out to them. For the visual feedback group, so again, they also had trainings every other week on Pota and Ka separately. After completing the pretest, the visual feedback group took part in a different activity. What they did is they were asked to bring their laptops with them to the class the next day. And what they were able to do was open up Praat, and this is what they would see. They would see their spectrogram and sound waves. So they're asked to look at their first 4 words from their carrier phrase task. Once they did that, they were asked to compare them to a native speaker production that the instructor had placed on the screen for them to look at. There was also, and I'll get to this on the next slide, there was also an audio-visual confirmation for the differences between native speaker and non-native speaker productions. Now, what I do want to point out is how this is nice and separated out for each of the sounds here for do, do. This was not the case for the learners. They only saw the spectrogram and sound waves, and they were asked to find out or discover what are the differences. They weren't explicitly told. So again, here's this is an example of a native speaker of Spanish. There's very little aspiration at the beginning of this word, Paco. So they were asked to compare their production of Paco with this production here to see what might the difference be. They were also shown this slide, but again, they were not shown todo separated out like it is up here and here. This is a native Spanish speaker, this is a non-native speaker, so they were asked, again, what do you think the differences between the two might be? And then they were also played these sound clips. So this is a native speaker of English.
Todo.
And then this is a native speaker of Spanish.
Todo.
Okay, so now for the combination instruction group. So again, for this group, they participated in activities that were similar to the explicit instruction group and the visual feedback group, but it was really just a combination of the two. So, they have the International Phonetic Alphabet symbols. They also were told the differences in place and manner of articulation. They did a repetition exercise modeled by the instructor. They looked at spectrograms and sound waves of native speakers and non-native speakers. And they were also explaining the differences in voice onset time using simple terms like, look at this part, it's darker or lighter, and then also can you see longer, shorter. They also worked on a worksheet that instructed them how to compare their productions to a native speaker. And so here, as we can see, both forms of instruction were integrated together. So for example, here we can see the use of the IPA symbols. We have pa with the little h here, ha, to show that there's aspiration, and then we have the onset of and this is for the word bako. And then it was highlighted for them here, this is where the aspiration is. Then they had a different example down here with the IPA symbols, pa, a, and it was also already measured out for them. This is where the aspiration is, and here's where the vowel starts. For our control group, these participants in this group, they only took part in a cultural activity every time that there was any type of instructional treatment going on for the other groups. This consisted of a short cultural reading with some questions at the end. This was intended to have the same duration as the other 3 types. So all 4 activities were only meant to take about 10 to 15 minutes. And again, no pronunciation, instruction, or feedback of any kind was given to this group. Alright, so let's get on to the analysis. So first, here we have the number of participants, tasks, pretest and post-test, and tokens. So initially we started out with 11,280 tokens, but because of different errors that arose, such as background noise, or producing incorrect word, laughing, things of such, and then also outliers that were found. We eliminated those and then had a final total of 10,552 tokens. So all data points were measured by hand via Pratt by the researcher. There was a normalization procedure that was run. This is to account for differences in place of articulation. And what I mean by that is, for example, pa in English has an aspiration duration or a VOT value that is shorter than ka in English. Ka, that aspiration value is much longer. So, in order to account for that, we assigned 0 for more Spanish-like and 1 for more Spanish-like, depending on the duration of the different types of voiceless plosives. That way we were able to collapse all of the data together and analyze all of it at once. So for the statistical analysis, there was a linear mixed effects model that was run. We used the normalized voice onset time as the dependent variable, so these values as the dependent variable. Group and time were set as fixed effects, and then here subject and item were set as random effects. For the significance criterion, this was set at an absolute value of 2 or more. Okay, so here are our results in this graph for the carrier phrase task, and this is the most controlled, and this is task 1. So here we have control group, explicit instruction, visual feedback, combination. So down here is group. Then we also have, by color, we can see the darker color here is the pre-test, and the lighter color here is the post-test. And here we have duration, so duration of each plosive. So, what we want to see here, because again, the objective is to reduce the aspiration value in order to see if students have improved. So, we want this yellow item here to be lower in order to show that they have improved. So when we look at the control group, there's not really much of a difference between pre-test and post-test. However, if we look here at the explicit instruction group, we see that yes, they have decreased in their aspiration values. For visual feedback, we see the same thing, they have decreased, and the same for the combination group, we see this stark decrease from the pre-test to the post-test. So then if we look at the statistics, we can see, as we've got the control group set as the intercept, if we go to the post-test, we can see here numerically that for the significance criterion, that the control group did not improve. However, for each of the three experimental groups, explicit instruction, visual feedback, and combination instruction, they all significantly improved. Okay, and now this is for the spontaneous speech task. This was the least controlled task, so the picture task. And we can see some very similar results here. So if you look at the control group, again here, we see that actually their aspiration values have gone up a little bit. So again, what we really want is for them to go down, but the control group, they go up. For the explicit group, we see from pre-test to post-test the values going down, the same for visual feedback, and then we see the same thing for the combination group, the values are going down. And if we take a look at the statistics here, we see that the control group actually got significantly worse, but the experimental groups all significantly improved. Okay, so now we're going to do a between group comparison. So we're going to look at the combination instruction group and see how they compare, or how they performed in comparison to the explicit instruction group, visual feedback, and control group for task 1, 2, 3, and 4. So first thing we see, the combination instruction group actually significantly did better than the explicit instruction group, and this is represented by this green check mark. For task 2 and 3, they performed about the same, but also for task 4, combination outperforms explicit instruction. So now we look at visual feedback in comparison to combination. The combination group significantly improved more than the visual feedback group in task 1, 2, and 3, and then they did about the same in task 4. As we already know, the combination instruction group outperformed the control group in all tasks. And then just to re-emphasize here. Now the reason that this is interesting and noteworthy is because for the explicit instruction and visual feedback group, there was not one time that they outperformed the combination instruction group. So here we can see that combination instruction has majorly outperformed all groups. Okay, so getting back to our research questions to kind of wrap up this study. Does pronunciation instruction as explicit instruction, visual feedback, or a combination of the two result in improvement of second language pronunciation? And then our second one, in a comparative analysis, is there a difference in the effectiveness of the three different types? So is one better than the others? So our first one, we say all experimental groups will significantly improve. And then for the second research question, while all will improve, the combination instruction group will improve the most. We see that hypothesis 1 is supported, and we also see that hypothesis 2 is supported. All right, so now let's talk briefly about the literature for the second language perception study. So, as researchers have looked into the effect of pronunciation instruction on second language production or pronunciation, there have also been several studies that have indicated that it's unclear what the role is that is played by perception in learner improvement of pronunciation, if any. This is because it's often presumed that perception always precedes production. However, there are very few studies that have actually investigated the relationship between adult second language perception and adult second language production. So, while learners may be capable of distinguishing between different sounds, this does not necessarily mean that they're able to identify or assign certain sounds as being more native-like in Spanish or more non-native-like. For such a task like this, a Likert scale type of rating has been utilized in previous methods. So we get to our research question. Does pronunciation instruction implemented here, again, visual feedback, explicit instruction, or a combination of the two, result in an improvement of perception? So in this case, improvement of perception is defined as perceiving short lag pronunciation as more Spanish-like and long lag pronunciation as more English-like. So the hypothesis is second language learners in all of the production training groups will demonstrate significant improvement in identifying Short lag pronunciation is more Spanish-like, and long lag is more English-like after receiving training. So let's get on to our methods. We had the same participants, and they took part in a Likert scale nativeness judgment task, and this was done pre-test and post-test, so it was done before any of the training and then after. Aspirated and non-aspirated variants of P'taka were paired with A-E-O to follow 2 variants per plosive, so we had a total of 24 that students rated on the Likert scale. Only 1 token was played at a time for the second language learners, and they were asked to rate on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being native and 7 being non-native. So here I have an example of what their sheet looked like. So again, 1 is native, 7 is non-native. And then here's an example of what they heard for the word keme.
Keme.
So in this particular instance, there was more aspiration, so we were hoping that after receiving training, they would identify that as more non-native.
Keme.
Okay, so all recordings were taken from a native speaker of Spanish. They were recorded and spliced in Pratt. And the speaker produced several productions of each token, several with exaggerated aspiration, several without, so that we kind of had a balanced inventory to choose from whenever we were designing the perception tasks. Okay, so again, just to give an idea of the order of tasks, we did the Likert scale nativeness judgment task pre-test, production training pa, then ta, then ka, then we did the post-test. So let's look at the analysis. For the analysis, again, these were all done on a scale of 1 to 7, and what's really important to highlight here is 1 equals native and 7 equals non-native. So there was an average done for each. Native speaker ratings were contrast coded for the analysis. So, for example, any that students heard that were of a native speaker of Spanish and the number they assigned them, so if they assigned them a low number of 1 or 2, this was contrast coded. For example, 1 was then converted to 7. The reason that this was done again was to collapse all the data so that all the data could be combined for the analysis. Here again we did a linear mixed effects model. Numerical rating was the independent variable, or dependent variable. Group and time were set as fixed effects, and subject and item were set as random effects. And then again we had our significance criterion set at 2, an absolute value of 2 or more. Okay, so here, what ended up happening was the control group actually got significantly worse. So what was happening when we ran the statistical analyses, that the control group's results were kind of inflating how well the other experimental groups did, so we had to remove them from the analysis. So, in just looking at the explicit group, explicit instruction, visual feedback, and combination, again, since we did the contrast coding, okay, here, improvement looks like a higher number. Okay? So what we want to see again, we want to see a higher number for improvement for pre-test in the black and post-test in the gray. So as we can see here for explicit, there's a little bit of a rise in the numbers. So they did a little bit better. Visual feedback, a tiny bit, they barely can see it. But if we look here for a combination group, we see a little bit larger of an increase in numerical ratings. So when the statistics were ran, it was found that the combination group was the only group that significantly improved from pre-test to post-test in category assignation, so aspirated versus non-aspirated variants. And that, again, here we see that they improved significantly. All right, so let's go back to our research question. Does pronunciation instruction result in an improvement of perception? And then in this case, judging reduction in aspiration as more native-like. We hypothesized that L2 learners, or second language learners, in all the training groups would be successful in identifying a reduction in aspiration as more native-like. However, what we saw here was that only one group significantly improved. We saw that all showed a trend to improve somewhat, but there was only one group that improved significantly. So, moving on to conclusions for both studies. For the general discussion, just to refresh our memories, this supports the notion that second language learners at a lower level have the capacity to learn and improve second language pronunciation. So, normally, types of interventions for second language pronunciation are done with second language learners that are typically enrolled in maybe a phonetics course or a higher level foreign language course or second language course. However, here, as you can remember, that our second language learners were only at level 3 Spanish. So, even though they have a lower level, they do have this capacity to learn. This answers the call of the comparative analysis to identify if any method is supported as significant for learner gains. So, if any method of the 3. So here we found that the combination instruction group, this method significantly outperformed the other 2 methods. However, again, this relationship between second language perception and pronunciation is still unclear. While we see, again, that there was some trend for improvement, only one of the groups improved significantly. So, for the pedagogical implications, first, we see that all 3 methods are shown to improve learner pronunciation. So this confirms previous studies with effectiveness, but this also incorporates this new idea of combination instruction. So, based on what we saw with all of these groups, there should be some sort of consideration for implementation of one or all of these methods into second language curriculum for teaching. This also confirms that second language learners who are adults do benefit from some type of intervention to improve pronunciation skills. And then as far as implementation into the curriculum, what would be ideal is allowing a small amount of time dedicated each day to second language learners in their classrooms or in their curriculum in a more concrete fashion and not necessarily an ad hoc approach, while not taking away from other important aspects of learning such as grammar and vocabulary, etc. For future directions, so for the perception study, and I'd like to point out this would be within a year. For the perception study, I'd really like to run an analysis that investigates the correlation between students' perceptual skills and their production improvement. And this is in the data analysis phase. Excuse me. Learner attitudes. So another thing that has been done at the close of this study, I had the instructors distribute a survey inquiring what the students thought about their particular type of pronunciation instruction and what their attitudes were toward it. And so I'd also like to run a study in which I see how do the results of the attitudes of these second language learners, how do they correlate with the results? So for example, the combination instruction group. Since they outperform the other groups, do the students regard their type of training, do they assign it a higher value? Do they value it more? Do they have a more positive attitude toward it? Then long term, what I'd like to look at in the next 3 to 5 years. So something that really occurs to me that has to do more with intelligibility issues is vowel production, vowel pronunciation, especially in Spanish. So I'd like to examine different approaches to see what would be the best practices for teaching vowel pronunciation in Spanish. And then secondly, I'd like to investigate native speaker perceptions of accentedness and fluency. I've run a pilot study on this, and I'm in the process of developing this into a larger study. But it was found that, so these are preliminary results, but it was found that although fluency measures, maybe a student had, by measurement, a higher rate of fluency, if they had less accented pronunciation, sometimes native speakers rated them as more fluent, even if there were students who were more fluent with a heavier accent. So I'd also like to investigate that. Thank you for coming. Any comments or questions are welcome. Also here, again, my name is Heather Offerman, and my email address is listed here. It's hofferma@purdue.edu. Thank you very much.